In this video we're going to talk about macroeconomics, and in particular at the objectives of government macroeconomic policy, the goals of the macroeconomic policy, what the government wants to achieve, and also the means it has at its disposal to achieve those goals. What mechanisms or what tools can it draw on to try to achieve the macroeconomic goals it has set itself. So we'll start by looking at macroeconomics. Well, it's the study of the behaviour of the economy as a whole. We're not looking at individual firms or companies or individual consumers or individual industries. We're looking at macro. We're looking at an aggregation of all of these. We're looking at consumer behaviour in total. We're looking at consumption expenditure, perhaps. We're looking at investment expenditure. Not investment within one particular company or within one particular industry, but perhaps investment in the whole country. We're looking at the total amount of investment. And we're looking at policies which can help to improve or change one of these macro variables: investment, consumption expenditure, the rate of economic growth, or whatever it is we're looking at. It concerns the business cycle that leads to unemployment and inflation. It looks at international trade, it looks at growth, and longer term trends in output and living standards. So macroeconomics is operating at a high level of generality. It's looking at the totalities of these. It's looking at all of investment or international trade. It's not looking at the trade in one particular item. It's looking at all international trade, looking at the imports and the exports of the country, looking at the overall rate of economic growth in the country. So it's operating on a very general level, looking at the whole country and looking at these in total, these aggregates in total. Now let's look at the macroeconomic goals. Well, output, the government tries to have a high and sustained level of output because, in a sense, that's what the economic system's about. It's about having output that meet the requirements of its citizens, of the people. It requiring outputs of food and shelter and clothing, and then higher order goods, cars and luxury items. So it's the ability of the country to produce these and the total amounts produced. The government will also look at employment, high levels of employment and low involuntary unemployment. So, for example, the government might set as a target full employment. Now, obviously, it'll have to define what it means by full employment, but essentially what it wants is a high and sustained level of employment, where all the people who want to work and who are willing to work at a going wage rate are able to find employment. That's the ideal. It also wants stable prices. Let's just go back to stable prices for a second. Stable prices means very low rates of inflation. So the government wants to control inflation. It doesn't want rampant inflation, which can be quite destructive, as we'll see later, for the economy. International trade, well, it wants to see imports and exports balanced. It doesn't want to have a lot of imports and few exports. Imports have to be paid for, and when we import a lot, it means we have to pay for them, and we're poorer as a consequence. Admittedly, we have the imports, but we still have to pay for them. So it tries to find an equilibrium between imports and exports. Sometimes students of economics think, well, why not aim for a surplus? A surplus sounds good. Surplus on the foreign account, on the international trade. Well, the problem with the surplus is that we would be exporting real goods and services, perhaps exporting machinery or exporting cars or exporting services, banking services or whatever. We would be selling these abroad, and in return we'd be receiving their currency. So in a sense, they're getting something real. They're getting machines and equipment and banking services. They're getting something off the country, and in return, they're paying us with their currency. So we're getting, if you like, dots on a magnetic tape. So the trick is to really balance international trade. That's the ideal, where the value of the imports equals the value of the exports. Not to simply continue to export and get just dots on a magnetic tape or pieces of paper, which is their currency. So ideally, the country should have a balance on its balance of payments. Overall, it should come to imports equals exports. Let's talk about output for a second. The ultimate objective of economic activity is to provide the goods and services that the population desires. That's what we want. We want our satisfaction. We want goods that give us satisfaction. We want this met. We want to have food, various types of food. We want clothing and shelter. These are the basics. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the context of other classes. So we have basic requirements, but we also have higher order. We want television sets and music centres and cars and foreign holidays, and so we have higher order requirements as well. And what we want is an economy that produces these items. The most comprehensive measure of the total output of an economy is known as the gross national product, known as GNP. And government statisticians work out, or attempt to work out, what the gross national product is. How much was produced in the country in a given time period? What is the gross national product? It tries to add up all of the outputs from the various companies and the various industries and occupations, tries to add it all up and give us a figure for this, so we can judge how big the economy is. We can compare the economy to other countries, and we can also compare how we're doing now compared to how we were doing, say, last year. So having a figure is felt to be good because it gives us a position, it gives us a fix. We know where we are. We know where we are compared to others and how well we're doing compared to other countries. We know how well we're doing compared to in the past. Let's talk about GNP a little more. Nominal GNP is measured in actual market prices. That's why we call it nominal. There's a difference in economics between nominal and real. Nominal is measured in money terms, but real is when we allow for inflation. You see, output could appear to grow in money terms because of inflation. Prices are rising. In fact, we're producing the same amount, it's just we're selling them at higher prices. But in terms of the amount produced, it could be the same. So we need to allow for inflation to give us real GNP. But here we're talking about nominal GNP. It's measured in actual market prices. It takes the prices that the companies charge in the shops or amongst each other and multiplies it by the amount produced. That gives us the nominal GNP. The statisticians then add this up for all the companies in the country. So real GNP is calculated in constant, or if you like, in invariant prices, constant prices. So we take a baseline. We say, let's fix the prices at the year, whatever, the year 2000. Now we'll compare all prices and we'll compare, all outputs and all values against the year 2000. So we take the price level at the year 2000 and make that 100. Then we use an index to work out what the current prices are compared to the year 2000, and then we deflate the figures by that amount. So it's a calculation that statisticians can do. So we're able to work out the real output, to see what's happening to real output over time, the actual number of goods and services produced. not the money value of the goods and services, but the actual amount of goods and services, because we can control for prices. So there is a difference between real and nominal, and you should be clear about that distinction. Potential GNP is the long-run trend in real GNP. It's the long-run trend. That's the potential GNP. It represents the long-run productive capacity of the economy, or the maximum amount the economy can produce while maintaining stable prices. That's the potential GNP. If we look at it on a graph, it would look something like that. We have this trend line, if you like. We have actual GNP, which is rising over the years. This is real GNP, by the way, real, allowing for changes in prices. Could be in dollars or in pounds or in euros or in rupees or whatever. So we have changes in real GNP. The actual amount of output, let's say, is increasing, and it's increasing according to the blue line on the diagram. And then we fit a trend line in, which gives us an indication of what's happening in the economy. What's the underlying trend? In this case, the underlying trend is upwards, so more is being produced over time. Now let's turn our attention to unemployment. Unemployment, the unemployment rate measures the fraction of the labour force that is looking for but cannot find work. Now, this means they're looking for work at the going wage rate, but they can't find it. They can't find work. They're willing to accept the going wage rate, whatever that is, but they just can't find work. It includes all employed persons. The labour force includes all employed persons and those unemployed who are seeking jobs. So the labour force is the total of all the people working in jobs plus all the people who want work at that wage rate. So that's the total labour force. Those are the people who want work. Now the unemployment rate tends to move with the business cycle. So we'll always have increasing unemployment at certain times of the year. In the middle of winter, there'll be a lot of redundancies amongst farm workers. There's no work on the farms. People who work beside the seaside in amusements and that sort of entertainment industry beside the seaside, well, not many people go to the seaside in winter. So they will be redundant as well in the winter. There'll be other times when there'll be a shortage of labour, perhaps. Sometimes coming up to Christmas, some companies may have to work extra hard to produce output to meet Christmas requirements. Now, stable prices. Well, the third economic goal is to maintain stable prices within free markets. So the government tries to control the price level. We'll find out when we deal with inflation in a different class that inflation can actually be very dangerous. It can lead to a complete collapse of the economy. If we lose confidence in money because prices is rising, it can lead to a collapse of the economy, which could mean a collapse of government, a collapse of the country. So controlling prices is very important. The government must do this. But the government must control prices whilst allowing the free market to work, because it's the free market mechanism that judges what customers want, what goods we want, when we want them, where we want them. These are entrepreneurial decisions. So the government doesn't take those decisions. Entrepreneurs take them. Business people take them. They do it in the interest of making profit. They don't do it out of goodwill. Chances are they do it because they want to make a profit. Let's be honest about that. But the government must control the overall price level. If inflation is rising what it deems to be too high, perhaps too high might need definition. It may be too high compared to what's happening in other countries. Or it may simply be that the government thinks it's too high in absolute terms anyway. Inflation is too high, so it needs to control it. So it's one of the major roles of government to try and control prices. Now in the UK, the government has largely handed this over to the Bank of England. So the Bank of England, who is independent of government, makes independent decisions of government, they control prices and try to ensure that inflation does not get out of hand. A market economy uses prices as a yardstick to measure economic value. That's how it works. We measure value using prices. We take the number of items produced and multiply them by the price. That gives us the value. Now, if prices are rising because there is some problem in the economy, perhaps too much money in the economy, then we have an issue that we're not too sure of the value of the output of that economy. We find it difficult to compare the output of the economy with other economies, or difficult to compare what's happening in the economy now with what happened, say, last year or 10 years ago. So it's important that the government control prices. Rapid price changes can lead to economic inefficiency. For a start, accountants find it difficult to value assets for a company. The assets are changing because the prices are changing, so the value of the assets are changing. Profits may appear to be bigger because prices have changed, but in fact the amount of output has remained the same. It's just because of inflation, the amount of output is multiplied by a bigger figure. Well, that can be problematic. But also, as customers, we find it difficult to keep up with changing prices. So sometimes we know, because of our lifestyles, we know what the price of certain items are. Well, in times of inflation, those prices will be changing rapidly. We have to search all the time to try and find the best value. Whereas in the past, we knew what the value of the item was and what the price should be. But now, because of inflation, we have to search for the best prices. And companies will have to do the same for perhaps raw materials. So it leads to inefficiency. As I said, this will be the subject matter of a separate video. Now, inflation itself, well, the most common measure of overall price level is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. The Consumer Price Index measures the cost of a fixed basket of goods bought by the typical urban consumer. So how we work out a price index is we look at what items people generally buy. We try to find out what items are popular. Perhaps eating out is popular, perhaps. Or people need to buy salt, or people buy bread, or people buy certain foodstuffs, certain amount of fish or meat or whatever. So try to imagine a basket of goods which would be representative of what people tend to buy. Say people living in a city might buy. Now, how has the price of that basket of goods varied over a time period? So what the Statistics Office do is they pick out these items and then they ask a large number of families in the UK to keep a diary of what items they purchased and how much they paid. And then they take back the diaries and they analyse the prices that were paid and the amounts purchased and so on. And they're able to then estimate inflation out of that sample of data. So the data from the diaries is turned into information. It's processed into information, and out of this the government gets an idea of the rate of inflation. So it's based on a sample of customers who keep diaries and submit the diaries to the statistics, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, who then do the calculations. The rate of inflation measures changes in the level of prices. It denotes the rate of growth or decline of the price level from one year to the next. So the rate of inflation measures changes in the level of prices. Now, inflation or deflation. Inflation is when prices are rising, and deflation is when prices are falling. So inflation occurs when the level of prices is growing, the rate of inflation is positive. It's upwards, prices are rising. Deflation denotes that the level of price declines. It's if you like, the rate of inflation is negative. It's the other way around, so prices are falling. So just to be clear about the definition of inflation and deflation. A distinction is a decrease in the rate of inflation, the slowing of the rate of inflation per unit of time. So disinflation, I should say, is a decrease. Disinflation means inflation is slowing down. If inflation was 10% and now the statisticians, the government statisticians, find out that the rate of inflation is 8% or 7%, you can see it's falling off. That's disinflation. The rate of inflation is slowing down. So we have, in a sense, three measures. We have inflation, deflation, and disinflation. Now let's talk about international trade. Well, international trade is becoming increasingly important in most countries' economies. The main reason for this, of course, is the opening of international trade, the opening of countries, the reduced amount of barriers to trade, and the whole process of globalization. International trade is beneficial to society, even if some individuals are harmed by it, because not everybody benefits from international trade. But the law of comparative advantage tells us that trading is to our advantage. It's better for countries to specialize in the items that they are particularly talented at producing, and then trade the surplus with other countries. So we know from the law of comparative advantage that trade, international trade, is good. It simply means that also that customers are able to receive a wider choice of goods from different parts of the world. And it also gives peoples in other parts of the world who perhaps before were unable to find work or were unable to export their goods, they're able to find new opportunities, and it can promote economic growth in different countries throughout the world. International trade includes imports and exports of goods, of services, capital, borrowing and lending money. So international trade is not just imports and exports of goods, physical goods. It can be services, banking, insurance, tourism. Can be capital. Companies set up plants overseas, so they export capital. But it also can include financial transactions, borrowing and lending, for example, and insurance and so on. So international trade covers everything across national boundaries. Net exports is the numerical difference between the value of a country's exports and the value of its imports. So that's net exports. Net exports is simply the total value of the exports of the country minus or less the value of its imports. So that's its net exports. Its net imports would just be the total value of its imports minus its exports. Sometimes people import, or countries import more than they export. When net exports are positive, a trade surplus exists. That's what we mean by a trade surplus. We have net exports. Exports exceed imports. That's a surplus. A trade deficit occurs when the value of imports is greater than the value of exports. So that's a trade deficit. They're very straightforward definitions, but they're ones which we must be aware of. We must know exactly what's meant by a trade deficit, a trade surplus, and so on. Now, exchange rate stability. Well, foreign exchange represents the price of own currency, our own currency, in terms of the currency of another nation. That's all the exchange rate is. So if we have rupees and we want to convert them into dollars, how much do we have to pay? That's the exchange rate. If we have dollars and wish to convert them into UK pounds, how much do we have to exchange? So we work out the exchange rate. How many, if we're living in London and we want rupees, how many rupees will we get to the pound? That's the exchange rate. When a nation's exchange rate rises, the price of imported goods fall, while exports become more expensive. For foreigners, the nation becomes less competitive in world markets and net exports will decline. Now we'll see how this works exactly in other sessions on the exchange rate, but when the exchange rate is rising, let's say we're in London and we can get so many dollars to the pound. Now, if the exchange rate rises, that means we would get more dollars to the pound. So that would mean that the exchange rate has increased. We're getting more dollars to our pound, but the price of imported goods, let's say paid a fixed price in dollars, means we have to offer more pounds in exchange. Sorry, for exports. So it means the Americans will have to get more pounds to buy our exports if we're from the UK. So if the exchange rate rises and we get more dollars to the pound, then that means that the Americans who import our goods will have to find more. We'll have to find more to buy pounds. In other words, the price of exports has increased. Now for our imports, well, we're getting more dollars to the pound, so we can afford more imports. So imports would rise and exports will fall. The price of imports would fall, so therefore more imports. The price of exports would rise, so less exports. Now we'll see exactly how this works using diagrams in other classes, but essentially the exchange rate is very important because it determines the amount of imports and exports a country will have. It's simply the price of one currency in terms of another. Changes in exchange rates can also affect output, employment and inflation. Well, if the exchange rate is changing, so we have changing imports, volumes of imports and different volumes of exports, then of course that will affect employment. People working in exporting industries will be affected. People working in industries has imports may be affected. It could in fact affect inflation, where the price of raw materials are rising coming into the country. So certain items may increase in price. It may not be inflation, but it might be destructive for one particular industry, one particular company that perhaps has a high proportion of its inputs are imported, and the price of those imports increase. So exchange rates are very important as values within the macroeconomic system. But as I said, we'll deal with those in much more detail in special classes on this topic. Now, macroeconomic policy instruments. Well, a policy instrument is an economic variable under the control of government that can affect one or more of the macroeconomic goals. So a policy instrument is something that the government can use to influence economic variables. For example, inflation could be affected by the rate of interest. Well, the government can influence the rate of interest. So the government could influence inflation, or it can influence investment, or it can influence anything, consumer expenditure, anything which is dependent on the rate of interest. The different policy instruments could be fiscal policy, monetary policy. Fiscal policy is just taxation and government expenditure. Monetary policy, looking at the money supply and the rate of interest. International economic policy, we're looking at the exchange rate, looking at relationships with other countries, imports, exports, anything to do with international economic trade. It could also be industrial policy, looking at help for companies going to particular regions, which could be also overlap with the regional policy. It could be investment, encouraging investment in certain industries. It could be training the workforce for particular skills which are required by certain industries. Let's look at fiscal policy. Well, fiscal policy is the use of government expenditure and taxes to affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So it's looking at the total government expenditure and taxes to affect the total demand in the economy. What we all spend, if we added it all together, that's our aggregate demand. So government can influence this through taxation. Clearly, if it taxes us more, we'll have less to spend. But also looking at aggregate supply, looking at perhaps taxation in the context of corporate tax. If it cuts corporation tax, industrialists have more incentive to invest and grow industries, and new companies may start up, and new industries may come into existence. So aggregate supply may change. Government expenditure includes government spending on goods and services. It determines the relative size of the public and private sectors. So the government can work out how much of the economy does it control and how much is left to the private sector. There's a big debate amongst many economists that what's the ideal size for the public sector. The public sector perhaps could be too big. The government could control too much of the economy, and that could damage the private sector. Sometimes it's called crowding out. The government has taken so much resources in the economy, there's nothing left for the private sector, so that the private sector can't develop. And it overlaps with other issues. For example, what would we call a centrally planned economy? Well, a centrally planned economy is one where the government controls the entire economy. In other words, the public sector is 100%. What would we call a purely capitalist economy? Well, where there's very little government activity. It's all private. That would be near to 0% public sector. And of course what we have is a mixed economy, which is somewhere in between. Now, whereabouts in between is a matter of debate. Some people say the public sector in some countries is far too big. Some people say they're not big enough. It's an issue for debate. Taxation affects the overall economy in two ways. Taxes tend to reduce the amount people spend on goods and services. So the more taxes we have, the less we have to spend on goods and services. So it will affect employment in the private sector. We buy less. We may also buy less imports, of course. Taxes affect market prices, thereby influencing incentives and behaviour. If we're taxed a lot, we don't buy the goods and services of the private sector, and the prices in the private sectors will have to fall, so profits will also fall. So there's less incentive for people to set up companies and employ workers, and the overall structure of the economy could be affected. So there is an amount that the government can tax up to. It's difficult to say what that is. There is one famous diagram known as the Laffer diagram, L-A-F-F-E-R. The Laffer diagram, and it just simply says that government revenue from taxes, well, if the government doesn't have any tax, the government revenue will be zero. Makes sense. But if the government has 100% tax, if it taxes everybody 100%, so every penny we earn we have to pay it to the government. If it does that, then nobody will work. Why should we work and just give everything to the government? Nothing left for ourselves. In that case, government revenue will be zero as well. So there is an in-between, and there must be an ideal amount that the government can tax. If it's too much, tax revenue will fall because people have less incentive to work, less incentive to start businesses or to continue in business. So the government must work out what the tax rate is. Monetary policy. Well, monetary policy determines the money supply as well as interest rates in order to achieve desired economic objectives. Changes in the money supply move interest rates up or down and affect spending in sectors such as investment, housing, and net exports. So the government, and sometimes through agencies, for example in the UK through the Bank of England, the government influences the money supply. It tries to work out what the money supply should be. Now, if the government puts too much money into the economy, that could lead to inflation. If it doesn't put enough money into the economy, it can cause problems in the economy. There's not enough liquidity in the economy to enable business to function properly. Now, this is sometimes looked at, we discuss it, in other classes under headings like Fisher's equation of exchange, and we look at monetarism, and we look at the role of monetary policy in more detail. But essentially here what we're saying is that the government has got a powerful economic tool in terms of monetary policy, the control of the money supply. If it reduces the money supply, there's less money. Given the demand for money, people have a demand for money to buy houses or to open businesses or to borrow money to buy cars or furniture or whatever people borrow money for. So if there's a demand for money and the government reduces the money supply, then the price of money will rise. The price of money is the rate of interest. So by reducing the money supply, the rate of interest will rise. Well, that will of course make borrowing more expensive. Now, people who are thinking of investing will therefore need to make an even bigger return on their investment because they have to pay more to borrow the money to make the investment. So clearly, changes in the rate of interest affect the real economy. They affect the ability of the business community to borrow money and to make a profit. Monetary policy is an economic effect. It's an important effect on both actual GNP and potential GNP. It influences the rate at which gross national product can change. So there is an impact between the monetary sector, changes in the money supply, and the real economy, investment, the goods markets, the amounts sold, because these will broadly be financed by borrowing. They'll go back through the banking system, and the price of money will have changed because of changes in the money supply. Now, international economic policy. Well, international economic policy consists of two sets of policies. Trade policies, which consist of tariffs, quotas, and other devices that restrict or encourage imports and exports. So trade policies usually involve tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. But it also could be a quota. For example, the government only allows so many items into the country. physically stops importation after the quota is reached. There could also be other devices that restrict or encourage imports. Sometimes governments may restrict imports for health reasons or for safety or for all sorts of reasons. So these are grouped under what we call trade policies. We also have exchange rate setting. The exchange rate represents the price of one currency in terms of the currencies of another nation, as I said earlier. And there are different systems to regulate foreign exchange markets. So the exchange rates, the exchange rate, as I said before, is just the price of one currency in terms of another. But there are different ways of regulating foreign exchange markets. Sometimes the governments allow it to be freely floating, or other times governments may try to restrict imports by restricting currencies. Some countries adopt very rigorous controls on imports, so they may not make monies available to pay for imports, or imports may have to be taken into the country under license, and the conditions of the license will be that only certain amounts will be available to pay for the imports. So some countries are very strict. Other countries are quite liberal and have open economies where it's up to individuals how much currencies they buy or sell or what to do. Now, there's also a possibility of something called an incomes policy. Now, this is really more economic history than practice today. So I said it's no longer used. An incomes policy was used in the past, for example in the UK. The idea here was incomes policies are a government's attempt to moderate inflation by direct steps, for example trying to legislate wages and control prices. Very difficult thing to do. By and large, I think historians would agree that these policies, or this type of policy, didn't work. Trying to control wages are determined by supply and demand, but trying to control wages is very difficult. Workers don't like it, employers don't like it. It ossifies the labour market, it restricts the labour market. And workers don't like it, they will go on strike and object to it, and that's what happened in the UK. And trying to control prices, that means controlling the whole economic system, because the economic system works through the price system. And trying to control prices, very bureaucratic, very, very complicated, and as I said, never really worked. They're the most controversial type of macroeconomic policy. Very difficult to implement, very controversial, not supported by the population, generally speaking. Now, macroeconomic policies and goals in practice. Well, macroeconomic policy requires choice amongst competing macroeconomic objectives. So we have to determine what are the objectives of the government. It's not always clear-cut what the objectives are. The objectives could be low unemployment. But does that mean high inflation? It could be high rates of economic growth. But what does that say about, for example, monetary policy and the provision of borrowing facilities to the private sector? So sometimes there are contradictions in the choice, and the government has to be clear about what macroeconomic policy it wants. There are economic dilemmas that need to be resolved. There's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, generally speaking. At very low levels of unemployment, inflation tends to be higher. So sometimes countries have to live with high levels of unemployment to try and control inflation. Now, we've talked about this in the context of the Phillips curve in other classes, and we will see it again in more classes to come. But by and large, many economists see this as a type of trade-off. But it may be that we simply move to what's known as the natural rate of unemployment, which could be some quite high level of unemployment, and we stay put at that and try to bring inflation down. But that means that some people will find it very difficult to find work. Some people may never find work. Then we have to ask about the fairness or the efficiency of such a system. Greater investment in knowledge and capital lowers current consumption. Well, if we have more investment in capital, that means the government is deflecting resources to perhaps industry, trying to build up industry. But that means there is less available for current consumption. Sometimes, for example, if the government wishes to make grants available to industry to try and encourage industry, that means those resources are not available to build schools or hospitals. So we have to decide, what do we want? Do we want industry to build up so we have a more prosperous country and perhaps pay for the hospital later? Or do we want the hospitals and the schools right now, but then we'll be poorer in the long run? These are very difficult questions, very difficult to answer and very difficult to even contemplate in some respects. But there are big decisions to be made, and this is why we have such controversy often in politics, because politicians try to argue over the merits and demerits of the various cases. There is something, a little diagram that we could look at here. It's called the magic quadrangle. We have a quadrangle, we have a square, let's say, and we have the growth rate on the top, G. We have the unemployment rate on the left, foreign trade or the trade balance on the right, and inflation or the price level on the bottom. And then we could insert in how we're doing at this moment in time. And it just gives us a little picture of the economy. We could just sketch in the economy, and we could look at how the growth rate was, and if it's higher, or we could put axes on here. We can say that from the center to the periphery is a certain measurement, 100% or 50% or whatever. But it just gives us a little picture of how the economy is doing. Now, economic variables. There are internal variables. These are policy instruments. For example, as I said before, fiscal policy, the relationship between government expenditure and taxation. Monetary policy, looking at the money supply and the rate of interest. Foreign economic policy, looking at exchange rates, but also looking at tariffs, obstacles to trade, globalization, looking at these sort of issues. Incomes policy, or other, not very popular and mostly historic, has been used in the past, but we don't really talk an awful lot about it nowadays because we don't see it as something that would be possibly used in a modern economy. But it was used in the past to try and control incomes by law, so to control inflation. But there are external variables. These are unaffected by the economy. They're sometimes known as exogenous variables. Exogenous means they just simply happen outside of the system. If you like, they're shocks to the system. They happen from outside. They're exogenous. For example, the weather. Now, this can be a problem in many countries. There may be droughts in many countries, not enough water, or there might be bad winters or hurricanes or typhoons. And in a situation where we're dealing with global warming and climatic change, this is likely to become even more of an issue in the future. So we'll have a lot of destruction caused by climate change, a lot of destruction in terms of typhoons and hurricanes and bad climate and so on. A lot of disruption as a consequence. So it's an exogenous variable. We also have population growth. We live on a small planet that circles the local sun, the local star. That's all we've got. We've only got this planet. One famous writer back in history, Thomas Malthus, Malthus. Malthus, very crudely, I'm not doing it justice here, but very crudely he said that the means of subsistence increases arithmetically. So in other words, the means of subsistence, our ability to feed ourselves and look after ourselves, this rises arithmetically. We get a 2% or a 3% growth rate every year. We work harder, we're able to use more land, and we're able to better use the land and so on. So we get a growth rate of whatever, 3%, 5%, whatever it is. But the population increases geometrically. So we have one male, one female, so we've got two people, and they get together and we have another human being. So now the population has gone up to 3. That's a 50% increase in the population. Output has only gone up perhaps by 5%, but the population has gone up by 50%. Now if people have more than 2 children, that means the world population is growing. And there is not enough resource on the planet to feed them. So we have a major problem with world population. That's one of the reasons why China had a one-child per family policy, to try and reduce the population, bring it down to manageable levels. If they have only one child per family, then the population will start to fall. And then later, of course, if the population fell sufficiently, they could go back to perhaps 2 children per family. But what they were trying to do is try to manage their population. We also have wars and revolutions. These seem to be happening at a never-increasing rate. They're based on all sorts of issues, disputes over land, disputes over historic problems, disputes over religion, disputes over you name it. And these take a lot of resources. Wars and disruption of this type are very destructive towards economic welfare. That's putting it very mildly. So these are some of the issues that we need to bear in mind when we talk about economic goals and instruments. As you can see, this is a wide-ranging talk. It's a very long talk. I suggest that when you're revising from this class, you stop the video many times and have a break and come back and make your notes very carefully and understand all of the issues in the video. But you can see it's very wide-ranging, and it's very important because it hits many of the issues that we see in economic policy. And we need to amplify these, of course, by having separate classes on each of them, on fiscal policy, on international trade, and so on the money supply, and different issues, which we do. We have different classes for each of these. But to take an overall view, like this class is attempting to do, you can see the complexity of the issues. So I suggest you go back over it very slowly, make some notes, and make sure you're clear about the notes, and perhaps do some further research into other videos and other sources of materials that the course provides on these topics. But that's all we're going to deal with for now, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.